Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. We have plenty of seats up here, so as you're grabbing your lunch, feel free to come in. Welcome to today's event on ICANN and Internet Governance. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm a senior analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'd like to welcome everyone that's in the room today, as well as everyone who's watching our live cast. If you'd like to participate via Twitter, you can use hashtag IETF. And we can take questions on Twitter as well as in the room. So the goal of today's event is to really discuss the role that the U.S. government has played in Internet governance and what role it should have in the future, specifically as it relates to the IANA function, which includes managing the root zone of the DNS and allocating the IP addresses. And of course, central to today's discussion is NTIA's recent announcement that it plans to give up oversight of ICANN and fully transition governance of the DNS and related technical functions to the international community. The transition obviously presents a number of challenges. Although ICANN has been responsible for these functions since 1998, it has done so under the guidance of the United States government. And the question really is, I think, will ICANN and the international community operate and act the same way in the future as they do now under existing U.S. oversight and authority? And when I've been thinking about ICANN, this made me think of a video I saw a few weeks ago. Someone had left their camera on to see what their dog does when they leave their house. You may have seen this video. It was going around a lot of things. So there was this big, fluffy bed that the dog clearly wanted to get on, but it had been trained not to get up on the furniture. And apparently it was always really well behaved when the owner was around. But then, as you see in the video, a few minutes after the owner leaves, temptation becomes too great, and the dog ends up rolling all around the bed for the entire time the owner is gone. Now, I'd like to visit Russia again, so I want to be clear, I'm not calling Putin a dog. But my point is that we shouldn't expect the behavior of ICANN or the international community to be the same after we remove the oversight that has provided the stability that we've had all these years. So, I also understand the transition here, it's politically unpopular in a number of circles. So NTIA is caught in a very difficult position. If it identifies risk, then those opposing the risk will use that to criticize the administration. But if it doesn't identify any of these risks, then we really run this big risk of going into the transition with our eyes closed and not being aware of where the challenges are and what we can do to mitigate those challenges. So my point here is actually pretty simple here. As we're going into this, if this transition is going to happen, we need to be working very diligently to identify the risks involved in the transition, things like transparency, accountability, stability, security, so that we can make sure we're doing everything we can to make sure we have safeguards in place. This is the issue that we're going to dig into. I have a great set of panelists here today to help me do this. First, we'll be hearing from Phil Corin. Phil is the founding principal of, first we're going to be hearing from Steve, but I'll introduce going through this way. So Phil is the founding principal of Virtual Law, a Washington, D.C.-based consulting firm. And he's represented a number of clients at ICANN proceedings. As well, he's an active participant in ICANN working groups and internet governance issues. Next to him is Steve Del Bianco. Steve is the executive director of NetChoice and a well-respected expert on internet governance issues. He advocates on behalf of business interests at ICANN, and as well, he's an active participant in the Internet Governance Forum. And Eli Dorado, who we'll be hearing from, is a research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. In addition to writing and speaking about these issues on internet governance, in 2012, Eli co-created the ITU transparency site WikiLeaks and participated in the conference as well as a member of the U.S. delegation. He also has some very interesting insights on this. So why don't we start with Steve and then we'll go to Phil.
Thank you, Dan. And when we talk about being experienced in this topic, it starts with 10 years of ICANN meetings, 5 congressional hearings, 7 years of the Internet Governance Forum, and then 4 years with the unfortunate distinction of being the policy chair for the business constituency at ICANN. And you can't just put your toe in the water of Internet governance. You end up falling completely underwater, and that's what it's been like for the past 10 years. things have really come to a head here, and Dan has asked us to answer two questions. The first was to assess the value of U.S. oversight so far, and the second was to talk a little bit about NTIA's decision. So I found a concept that worked in yesterday's House Commerce hearing. It was a simple analogy, and this was particularly helpful with congressmen. Perhaps a lot of you won't benefit much from it. But think of the top-level domain table, the .com, .org, .mil, .gov. Think of that table as a car. That is the core of the internet. Think of it as a car, and let's use a car and driver analogy. That car was designed and built by the United States of America in 1990. It's got a license plate on the back that reads IANA, IANA, which is the Internet Address Naming Authority. And in 1998, the U.S. government put it to the private sector and said, look, we don't want to be the driver of this thing. So the government said, we need a designated driver. And sure enough, we created ICANN to be the designated driver. So in 98, we take the car keys to the IANA car, and we turn it over to ICANN to drive. But the whole time, we say, you make the policies, but we're going to monitor your driving and make sure you take care of the vehicle. We kept, though, the whole time, while we allowed the keys to the car, we kept the title to that car. You guys don't know what a title looks like. So this is the IANA contract. So we would let them put it in the glove box while they're driving. But the title has not been signed over to anybody else. So the title still says U.S. government has custody of that car. In 2005, then, while all this is going on, Congress unanimously accepts a couple of resolutions that put things in a little different cast than the 1998 white paper. Congress said, quote, in HCON Res 268, that the authoritative root zone server, right here, should remain physically located in the United States, and the Secretary of Commerce should maintain oversight of ICANN. So in 98, it was all about giving it to the private sector, but by 2005, in the face of some of the intergovernmental pressures that Eli's going to describe, the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress took a little different view, and that was one administration. Now fast forward to 2009. Things are going a little bit better in 2009, and ICANN had matured enough to where the Commerce Department said, you know, we're going to give you more independence. We're going to really hand these keys over. We're still going to keep the title, but we're going to hand the keys over and have you operate under a code of conduct called the Affirmation of Commitments. It's a pretty impressive document. It holds ICANN to be committed to the global public interest, not just U.S. It has detailed reviews and recommendations, and Phil and I participated in a couple of these. And it's really like a charter or a constitution, the first constitution ICANN's ever had. But it's cancelable with 120 days notice. You can just walk away. And within a year of signing it, the previous chairman of ICANN is with me and a group of European parliamentarians, and I was suggesting the affirmation was such a great document, and the chair, Peter Dengay Thrush was his name, said, Steve, I think it's a temporary document and we'd like to terminate it as soon as we finish this transition. So ICANN didn't see the affirmation as a permanent charter and constitution the way a lot of us did. So some of the talk you'll hear about the affirmation being ICANN's fundamental principle document, have to understand it's a temporary document. In 2010, we showed some forbearance. This is helping to answer Dan's question, are we bully or are we bodyguard? In 2010, NTIA and its oversight demonstrated that we are going to protect free expression. How many of you remember the controversy over .xxx, right? The new top-level domain focused on the adult industry. It took a long time for them to get that contract through, and it came time for the governments to approve and to indicate their advice on it. And the governments were of two minds. You know, some governments love free expression. Some governments were really nervous about creating a red light district on the web. So they were muddled in their advice on it, which left it to the U.S. government to decide on that morning in June, were they going to put XXX into the root? Were they going to add it to the table? A lot of folks thought they would not add it to the table, but they put it in. It stood for freedom of expression, and they backed the process at ICANN that it approved it. So it went in. And then in 2012, when the last IANA contract, this title, when the last contract was awarded, NTIA put out an RFP and a solicitation of comments from the entire world. They had 2 rounds of comments from around the world suggesting to NTIA, here's how we think you could make ICANN run better at managing this root zone. The U.S. puts out an RFP, a request for proposal, and then cancels it because the only bidder, ICANN, was unwilling to step up and do the increased new security and performance requirements that were in the RFP. So they canceled the RFP. That certainly got ICANN's attention, and it showed the value, the leverage of saying that, yes, you've got the keys to the car, but you know this title? I'm not even going to let you put it in the glove box until you shape up. And that is precisely the impact it had. And Secretary Strickland acknowledged it yesterday by calling it symbolic value. But that symbolic value, to answer your question of whether we've used the oversight, we've used it for real effect. Symbolic value, but to real effect. So let me turn to the next question, which was, what about the NTIA decision? I think when you look back at 16 years and 3 different administrations, our government has protected ICANN and helped it mature, and that you might also see that the U.S. cannot retain that role forever. So are we bully or bodyguard? We have been bodyguard, but we can't be that role forever for the reasons of politics that I hope Eli and Phil will get into. Now, the timing of that decision is entirely driven by the pressure brought upon the United States as a result of the Snowden affair. But it would have taken almost any excuse for governments to continue to ramp up their pressure. I'll leave a lot of that for Eli. The question is, what does NTIA's transition say about the title? It doesn't say too much. It just says that we intend not to keep it forever. But it doesn't mean that Larry Strickland is going to flip the title over and sign it over to Fadi Shahadi at ICANN. It doesn't say that at all. He simply said to ICANN, would you please quarterback a process of figuring out how we're going to transition out of U.S. oversight? It might well be we sign that title over to an independent multi-stakeholder entity that would fulfill the U.S. bodyguard role for the past 15 years. It could happen. So NTIA said that come up with a plan and present it in the next year and a half, and there's 4 principles and 1 requirement you have to have in your proposal. The principles make completely good sense, and we'll probably talk about those. But principles alone are not going to be enough. I made my living as a programmer, and I can tell you if you handed me 4 principles and said code an app that does principles, I wouldn't know where to begin. I actually need use cases. I need instances of how people will use it, both intended and unintended, so I can program and handle the unforeseen circumstances. And that's one of the keys. And we'll call that use cases or stress tests or scenarios. And I think that the way to move back, I mean, thinking about it as the car and driver analogy for a second, if you tell your teenager that it's a good principle to drive carefully in the winter, how far does that get you? They really, to know if they get that, you've got to put them under a stress test and find out what happens when the back end of the car starts swinging to the left on an icy highway. And then we'll know whether they really have coded themselves to deal with that stress. In yesterday's testimony, I suggested 8 specific stress tests that should be applied to whatever solution the world community under ICANN's guidance comes back to commerce with. So a year and a half from today, somewhere in that period, they come back with either 1 or a few potential solutions. I want to evaluate those solutions against stress tests and invite all of you to help define more stress tests so that we understand more than just principles. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. I have copies of the testimony back there. A stress test could be, what if ICANN suddenly lacked the financial resources or technical wherewithal to execute the functions in this contract? Who would rescue the root? Who would rescue the internet core? Another might be, let's say ICANN, in their well-meaning drive to globalize ICANN and satisfy a global audience of governments, that they decide to set up a legal presence in Geneva, and then after a period of time they sort of cancel their legal presence as a California corporation. That's creating a lot of legal uncertainty for the contract parties with ICANN as well as those who want to hold ICANN accountable. And we should ask, in this stress test, how would the new proposal make sure that ICANN maintains a physical presence wherever it has contracts, including California? Another example, in the scenario 6 and 7, I talked about internet censorship. Because today you all know that censorship happens. It happens on the edge of the internet, though. It happens in a place like Turkey, where the government can compel all of the ISPs in Turkey to block access to Twitter. And they did last week, and I think it may have made a difference in the election. But at the time they did that, Twitter.com is still alive and well outside of Turkey. They're unable to block it at the core of the internet, but only at the edge. When we talk about stress tests, though, let's ask the question, what's going to stop the same kind of government censorship from moving from the edge to the core of the internet? Because then it affects the whole world. ICANN's Government Advisory Committee currently advises ICANN on policies, and the current plan is that the Government Advisory Committee has to act by consensus, which means that no single country would object to something. So it's unlikely they would decide to move censorship to the root. However, the governments can change their own rules anytime they want. By a simple majority vote, the governments could decide, let's not do this consensus anymore. Let's move to a simple majority the way we run things at the ITU and the United Nations. They're much more comfortable with that. And they're able to organize and generate allies for a voting position based on things that may have nothing to do with the vote. Could be due to alliances in economics and other things. So there were only 61 governments at the Singapore meeting at ICANN last week. That means 31 governments make a majority. A lot of mischief can happen when you only have to get 31 people to agree. So let's suppose that the governments, this is a stress test, not a prediction, stress test. So if the government's able to muster the 31 votes to say that a new top-level domain like .corrupt, and remember, any top-level domain is in this table. So .corrupt should get the permission of a national leader before it allows his name to be used in a domain. So Putin.corrupt would have to have the permission of the Russian government. That's a simple rule, and we already have a very similar rule. Virtually all the top-level domains need a government's permission to use the name of a country or territory or a city left of the dot. So this is just extending a concept. So it could happen. The question is, how would they react in mechanism? Because in today's world, the US government maintains the root, and I don't think the US government would take .corrupt out of the root simply because some countries don't want to use it for freedom of expression against national leaders. When we're out of the picture, when we let go of this title, how will the new mechanism answer the same question? So I think that I'm a little bit optimistic that we can solve this. And I believe the key will be to take all of our concerns, the concerns that Rob and Dan have raised, the concerns that a lot of you were thinking about, and channel those concerns into stress tests that can be applied against the solutions that come back. And I feel that's a better idea than just putting the brakes on everything, which is what some in Congress are talking about right now. That might send the exactly wrong signal to the folks who are pressuring us to relinquish control. Thank you, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And as Steve mentioned, we have two blogs in the back that I encourage you to take a look at. One was put out actually
weekend before?
The weekend, yeah, the day before the announcement and then right after the announcement. So you see it kind of before perspective and after perspective. Eli.
All right. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to IETF. And it's great to be here with my co-panelists. I largely agree with Steve that the U.S. has been a very good steward of the root zone. Technically, as we know, everything has run very smoothly, and for the most part, the management has been apolitical, and that's exactly what we want. We want apolitical, and we want technically competent. I would say mostly apolitical because there's another part of the .XXX story, which is that in 2006, the Bush administration did object to .XXX, and they did put some pressure on ICANN to withdraw the approval. So I just want to bring that up. That's I think maybe the one black mark on U.S. stewardship, and I want to bring that up just so that people are watching overseas, they don't think we're a bunch of flag wavers. I think it's fair to say that most other governments would not have been as liberal in their management of the root zone. So if that's the case, then why transfer it over? Why transfer over IANA oversight to the global community? I think that there's the real reason is something that I think most people haven't talked about. The title of this panel is Bully or Bodyguard, and so I don't think the U.S. has been a bully. Bodyguard is certainly closer to correct. And the U.S. has protected the DNS from the meddling of other governments. But I want to advance it just a slightly different view. Both bully and bodyguard are terms that connote strength. Right? The bully picks on you because he's stronger than you, and the bodyguard protects you because he's stronger than you. But I think in this sphere, I think that the correct model of the U.S. government isn't one of strength, but maybe one of weakness to some extent. Or at least it's weaker than you think. I don't think anybody doubts that the U.S. is militarily strong, and of course it has tremendous influence on what goes on in the world. But diplomacy is not straightforward. Certainly, if internet freedom were the administration's only diplomatic priority, there'd be no problem. But I don't think anybody realistically thinks that internet freedom is the only priority that the administration has, or even the top priority. So the problem with diplomatic issues is that they get linked to each other in not entirely rational ways. So governments are playing repeated games with each other. The U.S., of course, for better or worse, they're trying to influence world events in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, too many other places to list. And the U.S. expends a lot of political capital trying to keep the world stable. And we need other countries to sort of go along with a lot of what we're trying to do, and you might say that the U.S. is diplomatically overextended. So while U.S. oversight, as I've said, has been very constructive, I don't really see the U.S. as diplomatically strong enough to take the first best position on internet governance, which that I would like it to take, which is that government should have no role in it. So when countries at the ITU say, as they did in 2003, we need to have a world summit on the internet society, right? Which is, we're going to talk about internet governance. The U.S. isn't strong enough to say no thanks. And what we get out of that is the Tunis Agenda, which is a very flawed document. We have the GAC precisely because the U.S. is not in a position to insist on no governmental involvement at ICANN. And when other countries complain that the U.S. has a special role in internet governance and that it's unfair, the U.S. doesn't tell them to shut up and go away, to put it delicately. It sits down and listens to their concerns. It has to. That's what it means to be a global superpower. So I think that once we stop thinking of the U.S. government as this invincible bodyguard and more of a beleaguered and imperfect defender of internet freedom, operating in a highly constrained international environment, then the NTI's transition plans start to look pretty good. So that's true even if you believe, as I do, that the U.S. has done a good job and that many other governments are basically terrible. So one way to think about the transition is that it's a one-time expenditure of political capital by the U.S. to avoid a large and growing annual expenditure of political capital. So whether you think the transition is a good idea or not depends on how scarce do you believe that political capital is. So I've been arguing that it's not scarce, and then also how likely it is that we'll get an acceptable result for an amount of political capital that the U.S. is actually willing to spend right now. Which that's not a slam dunk, and I think it depends a lot on the kinds of conversations that we're having today. But nevertheless, I think I lean toward the optimistic side. And the other way to look at the transition is that it's simply a continuation of the trajectory that we've had from the beginning of the internet. That the internet began as a military experiment, and it's increasingly a private civilian enterprise. So in 1989, we opened up the internet to private commercial use. In the 90s, we privatized more of the management functions, as Steve said, and now we're privatizing one more. And the world has benefited from the early parts of that transition. So I think at this stage, at least, we should give the benefit of the doubt that the transition should continue, subject, of course, to the caveat that we don't know what the final plan is, and we can reevaluate that when it comes out and as it's developed.
Good afternoon. Delighted to be here with you. Generally, on the value of the U.S. Oversight role up to today, I think it's the U.S. exercise of its role has been generally benign. There's been no history of abuse. The only thing anyone can point to is .XXX, which is something that many other nations were concerned about, something that, frankly, the ICANN board only went forward with when they were threatened with litigation by the applicant. So, but that's the one standout. It's had value. It's disciplined ICANN to maintain the affirmation of commitments, which benefits the entire global internet community because of the need to renew the IANA contract. That's the discipline. That's the leash on ICANN. It has helped to maintain principles of dedication of free speech and free markets on the internet. And frankly, the U.S. presence, while benign, it occupies a space that if the U.S. wasn't there, other governments would be tempted to move in. Power abhors a vacuum, and when the U.S. withdraws, I'm skeptical that it's going to be occupied just by the global multi-stakeholder community, whatever that is. I think other governments will see that as a signal to pursue their own agendas. Reaction to the NTI announcement. I think we need to all understand how we got to this point, what's responsible for the timing. The Snowden revelations about the NSA activities started coming out late last spring, early summer. There was an ICANN meeting in Durban in July of last year. The management board could have easily sought feedback from the community on what they thought that meant for ICANN and the present arrangements. There was no attempt to do that. What everyone thinks about the NSA activities, and I have my own concerns in certain areas, the relationship to ICANN is a total red herring. The U.S. control of the IANA contract has zero impact on the ability of the NSA or any other national intelligence service to conduct internet espionage. It's two completely different things, but the ICANN board and management chose to utilize it to begin a process to break free of the final vestige of U.S. control. There was a board resolution passed in September 2013, passed in secret. It was not revealed to the community until several months later, which is not consistent with the commitment to transparency. That resolution authorized the CEO, Fadi Chehadi, to travel to Montevideo, Uruguay in October, which produced the Montevideo Statement. He then traveled to Brasilia, met with the president of Brazil, requested that Brazil host this meeting, which is happening later this month, the Net Mundial meeting. And I believe, I'm not privy to any internal NTIA documents, I believe that the timing was an attempt by the U.S. to both defuse what might come out of the Brazilian meeting and also to set some limits, saying the U.S. is willing to give up this last vestige, this last unique vestige of the U.S. role vis-a-vis ICANN, subject to these limitations. So if you want to propose something that goes beyond, we're going to have to say no. So I think that you need to understand the timing. And CEO Chehadi at the time was quite clear. He said that the NSA revelations had undermined trust in the internet and that the relationship with the U.S. was no longer sustainable. That's all on the record. The content of the NTI announcement, it's good as far as it goes. The four principles are fine, but there's a dog that didn't bark. I don't see any mention in the announcement of a continued commitment to accountability mechanism or to continued private sector leadership, which has been the bedrock of ICANN up to now. The statement in the NTIA, the bright red line, that it will not accept a government-led or international governmental organization solution does not preclude greater governmental involvement. And in fact, the Montevideo Statement, I think, is perhaps a more significant document than the NTIA announcement in terms of a fundamental change in ICANN. Governments within ICANN up to this point have been subordinate to the private sector. They have had an advisory role. They have not had a control role. The Montevideo Statement, the key principle here is that the groups, the internet groups that met in Montevideo, quote, they called for accelerating the globalization of ICANN and IANA functions towards an environment in which all stakeholders, including all governments, and there's a lot of not very good governments in this world, participate on an equal footing. That's a very fundamental change in the operation of ICANN. And that's one that would fit within the acceptability criteria of the NTIA announcement. I would also note that CEO Chehadi from the beginning has said, well, this multi-stakeholder model, we really need a multi-equal stakeholder model, including governments. Now, again, that's a big change, and I'm more concerned about that than about the U.S. counterparty role and what might replace it. I think we all need to recognize there are a lot of questions yesterday. How can we guarantee long-term bad things won't happen? We can't. This, whatever comes out of the transition plan, may yet be another transition phase to yet a further iteration down the road once ICANN is free from all U.S. Oversight. I think we need to remember that we're not dealing with an organization, ICANN, that's operating with perfection right now. There are many continuing problems within ICANN, even under the current accountability mechanism. There's inadequate transparency, in my opinion, particularly at the board level. There are questions about their proficiency at their number one job, which is technical manager of the internet. There's an issue, we could spend all hour on an issue called name collisions, but it's rather remarkable that ICANN didn't recognize that this issue was going to rise with 1,000 new top-level domains. It's increasing top-down management rather than bottom-up multi-stakeholder process within ICANN. The U.S. headquarter role, which is pledged during the affirmation commitments has already been downgraded, in my opinion. ICANN has set up co-equal hubs in Singapore and Istanbul, and in the C-SPAN interview last month, the CEO said, we used to have a U.S. headquarters, now we have tri-quarters. He's also said that ICANN is seeking to become an international organization. Other ICANN staff have said they're looking into a Swiss legal status, perhaps relocating some or all of their operations to Geneva. This is all going on under the present arrangement, so imagine what might happen after the transition. And all this is also going on when we have the biggest and riskiest venture in ICANN's history, the new TLD program rolling out, and all this talk of politics and transition has kind of eclipsed what's going on there, but it may not, there may be significant problems in that. From the discussion in Singapore, and Steve, it's hard to believe we were just there 1 week ago, I believe that the development by the community of a transition plan is going to be a long and complex process, and that the September 2015 endpoint of the current, that MGI will need that 2-year extension. And think about this, it took the community 3 years to design an applicant guidebook for the new TLD program, and this transition plan may be a lot more complicated, certainly a lot more politically charged than the new TLD guidebook. What I saw in Singapore was broad agreement in all sectors of the ICANN community that the IANA function cannot simply be handed over to the management with no, and with just the technical organizations exercising kind of a technical accountability, and the community does not, they pretty much told ICANN, we're going to develop the plan. It's not, you're going to not consult with us and come up with a plan based on what you hear. We're going to create the plan, and we'll see how that works out and whether the management actually goes with it. Finally, I think we all need to realize that whatever happens within ICANN on this discussion, that the process is not just confined to ICANN. Whatever comes out of Net Mundial this month has got an influence. The IGF meeting this year is going to have influence. The ITU meeting at the end of the year. So NTI is trying to keep the discussion within a process led by ICANN, but in the big world of politics, that's not the only factor that's going to impinge on that. So I'll stop there, and then we can get into further discussion.
Great. Thank you, Phil. So I want to dig into a few of the points that you made, and we'll kind of move on to some other things. But one thing that strikes me, and since both Phil and Steve were just in Singapore, at some point, the world lost the understanding of the role and value that the United States plays in its oversight. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of, if there's any appreciation of that. It used to be that the Commerce Department had pushed back on that. I mean, when a governance forum was created, they said, we're going to create this other multi-stakeholder forum, but the Department of Commerce has this unique role and it has value, and I think that value was recognized. And it strikes me that if that value is not recognized by this multi-stakeholder community as they develop a transition plan, there'll be no need for oversight and accountability, which is what the U.S. has provided.
Dan, I'd love to take that on in two respects, the business community and other governments. You're right. Prior to Snowden, our Commerce Department leaders were bold defenders of the multi-stakeholder model. And to hear Secretary Strickland stare down several hundred diplomats at the IGF in Kenya and tell them, there is no significant leadership role for governments to take over the internet as we know today. And he was very strong. Now that strength significantly diminished after Snowden, diminished practically to silence. And the allies who had previously agreed with us in other governments were themselves subject to NSA surveillance. So when we take our very best allies and alienate them, the way that Snowden revelations have, we've lost the kind of allies that would have stood with us, would have stood up and walked out of the room in Dubai at the wicket. The other is the business sector. The business sector is under tremendous pressure right now. They're very happy with U.S. stewardship of the internet route. They're very happy with the fact that if the UN passed a resolution tomorrow suggesting that they want to take over the internet, that the U.S. holding title would make that a non-starter. But the business community is also under pressure since foreign governments are using the Snowden revelations as an excuse to claim that data on their citizens should not leave their shores. It's a perfect excuse for a nation like Brazil to say that every Brazilian's information can't travel to a server in California anymore. You all stay in Brazil. It's an economic development boon for that country, since virtually all of America's leading tech companies would have to hire lots of employees and build servers in virtually every country. And even if they could afford it, think about what it does to tomorrow's Facebook and tomorrow's Twitter. If you want to start a globally reaching business, it's a non-starter to have to be financially strong enough to set up servers and have employees in every regime. You could never start a new company like that under those rules. So that would be a complete break on innovation in the world.
Bill, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm generally agreeing with Steve. Yeah, the U.S. ability to jawbone other nations has been at least temporarily diminished by the Snowden revelations. The business community, particularly the technology companies, are working on pins and needles, concerned about the loss of tens of billions of dollars in overseas business. And frankly, other governments don't share our values. I mean, and some are actively against internet freedom. They are in favor of measures to suppress dissent on the internet and free access to information. Others just believe, and you hear this a lot, and not from the African delegates at ICANN meetings, they just have a different culture. They believe private sector should be subordinate to governments. And something Steve said I want to amplify on. You see in some of the press the specter of a UN takeover. You don't need a UN takeover. There's a form of the UN already within ICANN. It's called the Governmental Advisory Council. Just by a single vote, as Steve mentioned, it can change its whole method of operation, and then start pressuring the board to have more influence over ICANN decisions. And in fact, in Singapore, at the mere hint of the transition plan, two great champions of internet freedom, China and Iran, spoke out at the GAC meeting and said, we need to change our method of operation. No more consensus. We have to operate by majority vote. And I'm not sure if the GAC operated by majority vote that we would see decisions that still continue to be sensitive to private sector needs and free speech needs.
So one issue that came up in all your comments and that we've commented on as well is the real question about, is there anything permanent in ICANN structure? Is there anything that wouldn't be changed going forward, or wouldn't be, if you take the perspective that some of this change would be bad, that would not be at risk? What is concrete? If they make any kind of commitment, how binding would any commitment actually be?
That's a good question. I think there's actually very little that is permanent in ICANN structure. I think it can change pretty significantly, pretty quickly, and so that's definitely something we need to look at going forward in this process. Is what sort of assurances can we get internally at ICANN to make sure that that there aren't really negative ramifications from this?
Yeah, you can't guarantee the future, and ICANN is a political organization. There's a lot of different forces within it, and they're always shifting positions, cooperating at odds. Governments, I think, are clearly going to have a more of a presence in ICANN of the future and more of an influence than they've had in the past. I think the best you can do is take this transition plan, develop it slowly and very deliberatively. You have to try to the best you can with stress tests to construct robust accountability mechanisms that really hold ICANN accountable to some recognized body in some meaningful way. And I think the transition has to be accompanied by some meaningful reforms to address the existing problems within ICANN. But I think that's the best you can do. After that, it's on its own. Once the U.S. gives the counterparty role away, it's permanent. There's no way. Members yesterday were saying, how can we get it back if things go badly? We're not going to get it back. Once you hand it over, it's gone, and the best you can do is design a transition plan that provides the greatest possible assurance. But the future, it's going to be written by people in the future acting on behalf of various interests and views.
I think you're both exactly right about the notion of you can't predict the future. If we had to have predicted the future and built a permanent mechanism, we'd never have the internet we have today. We actually invented it as we went along. We invented the governance model as we went along. That's what ICANN has been. But I'm going to disagree with Phil and Neelie on the notion of giving up now, on the notion of having something that's truly accountable. I believe that ICANN is not necessarily the default of taking over the management of the root table. It could be that the U.S. role, the one that holds the title, that can rescue the root, could be transferred to another multi-stakeholder body. I mean, think about it. Before the U.S. government was managing it, it was the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. So it's a group of, well, technologists who define the protocols. And it could well be, we've got a year and a half, that we could design a coalition of technology groups that are multinational, international, but not multi-governmental. And they may be given the opportunity, maybe they get the title and can take it back if whoever it is that's managing internet policies is trampling on free expression, the right of the private sector to have a leadership voice. We shouldn't assume away that ICANN alone is going to sign the back of this title. It could be that we come up with a different mechanism, and it won't be the U.S. government. I'm certainly going to agree with you there. We're going to let go, but who is it that we hand it off to?
Yeah, I agree. I think it could be even the root server operators
right.
could just sort of get together and when ICANN makes a recommendation for a change to a TLD, they just insert it. So this role could go away, in other words.
And Steve, just to make clear, I wasn't saying give up. I think we have to try to design the most robust and effective accountability mechanism we can in this transition plan process that began in Singapore. I'm not of the just say no camp. I think the genie's out of the bottle here with the NTI announcement. We have to engage in a very committed way. But we need to recognize whatever we construct, once the U.S. steps back, things are going to evolve based on their own dynamics and into the future, and there's no way to guarantee what's going to happen.
Dan, during Eli's remarks about suggesting that perhaps there should be no government role and that the U.S. was insisting on no government role, I'll put a different color on that. At ICANN, the governments do have a role. As you've all understood, the Government Advisory Committee. And they should. They're active participants in the global economy, and many governments claim to be the ones who represent their citizens. It's a foreign notion in many of these countries that the people need to speak directly to a body like ICANN. Naturally, the people of Sudan speak through one voice, the Sudanese government, right? So they have a different view of that. So we have acknowledged that governments have a role at ICANN, and they're learning how to gain that voice. They really have stepped up their game and participated, mostly in the new top-level domain program, for which 1,000 new top-level domains will be launched over the next year. But in that process, the rules dictate that the governments, or the GAC as we keep calling them, have to have a consensus. And that's really tricky for them to come up with positions to which no nation objects. That's how XXX made its way through the GAC. And when they came up with objections, they objected together to .islam. That's why we're not going to have a .islam. But they couldn't come up with a consensus on objecting to .amazon. The American company Amazon, the American company Patagonia wanted top-level domains, .amazon, .patagonia. And a handful of South American governments really felt that this would trample on sort of their regional sensibilities and cultural sensibilities. And they were able to convince a lot of other governments who could care less about Amazon and Patagonia that they should stand tall for the principle. And when it came down to the final consensus vote, there wasn't a consensus. A few nations didn't agree with that. And for that reason, it's muddled advice. And the ICANN board is allowed to disregard that advice and explain why. Well, that whether they do that or not is a function of how strong the board is feeling at the time. If ICANN is riding high and everyone's very happy with the way it's going, the board can be rather bold in the face of government advice. But if we start having some problems with this new top-level domain rollout, and a lot of governments are upset, and they're taking their grievances to the United Nations, the board starts to lose its backbone a bit, and it may actually accede to things like forcing every top-level domain to get the government's permission before it puts a government leader's name to the left of the dot. And that would be the beginning of the end of free expression and dissent.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, and maybe Steve or Phil, since you've been involved in this for so long, you can explain a little bit more about the decision-making process that goes on in ICANN. But we talk about it being a multi-stakeholder body, and it is. But ultimately, the board is taking votes. and the board is making decisions, and within the ICANN, official rules of governance, there are votes. I mean, there are votes, and there are people that can control things. So we talk about consensus, but at the end of the day, when decisions are made, they're still being made through votes. And can you just talk a little bit about how, and see if this gets to what you talked about earlier, where are the risks here? Where are the big challenges?
We can only talk about the current process. We don't know what the future process might be when governments are multi-equal stakeholders. I'm dubious they'll ever be equal. I think they're either going to be advisory or have a more dominant role. But there's an issue right now that shows exactly how the process works. There's an issue with the new TLD, the GAC, and I want to say the GAC, as Steve noted, there is a role for governments. It's a strong advisory role. The GAC really got much more activated out of concerns over the new TLD program, got much more engaged. As a result of that, it's now working the GNSO Policy Council, which is the multi-stakeholder council that develops policies for all generic top-level domains, everything except the country codes, the .us, .fr, .ru, etc. Is working with the GAC now to design a process to get the GAC engaged much earlier, so they're coordinating, so the GAC is being less reactive and a more inclusive process that brings the governments in at the beginning of the policymaking process. But right now, there's a loggerheads issue that puts the board in a tough position, and this is over an issue. There's all these international governmental organizations, as the UN listed them, IGOs and international non-governmental organizations, and it's about whether with the new TLDs, their acronyms, like WHO, WHO, or others. There's one
.eco,
.idea, which is an acronym. I forget the International Development something agency. Whether not just the full names, but the acronym should be blocked at the second level, at the domain name level, for all new TLDs. Now, the GNSO Policy Council, which is the policy-making body for GTLDs, looked at this issue and they said, fine on blocking the full names, but not blocking the acronyms, but we'll give them access to the existing arbitration rules, the dispute resolution processes. And they passed that unanimously. And the ICANN rules right now say that when the GNSO sets a policy in that way, that the board can only reject it if the board rejects it by a 2/3 vote. The GAC took an exactly opposite position. The GAC said, we insist that all of these be blocked, and under the rules for the program, the board is not bound to take the GAC advice, but they have to give great deference to it and explain why they're rejecting it if they reject it. So the board right now is caught between the GNSO Council and the GAC on a rather arcane issue, but it's becoming a test for who's going to be dominant, the multi-stakeholders or the governments, and it's kind of a test case, and we'll see how it plays out. But that gives you an idea of the present system. If you look at the organization chart of ICANN, it's not going to make any sense, and frankly, if you go to just one ICANN meeting, it's not going to make any sense. You have to really participate over an extended period to really understand how all the different parts interact and create a policy.
Yeah, but looking ahead, it's possible. It's possible that this new solution would call for a differently constituted board for the body left game. It might well call for a board that is representatives of multiple groups. It's far broader than what it is today, and that could end up changing the way that board would vote on issues that come up. Because today the board is it's relatively small and has very narrow sets of interest groups. But anybody who's elected to the board is supposed to actually serve the interests of ICANN and the internet in general. They're really not supposed to be up there voting for the particular constituency that elected them. I realize it's very hard to suddenly forget where you came from when you arrive at the board, and they should use that base of knowledge. But we can entertain new structures for ICANN as a condition to be the responsible custodian of the title to this IANA card. We can do that. We have to be creative about it, and we have a lot of time to get it right.
So just one point on the GAC and .amazon in particular. I think that .amazon underscores my point that these issues are linked politically and diplomatically, right? So, look at the timing of like when the U.S. threw Amazon under the bus, right? They threw them under the bus at Durban, which took place in July. The Snowden leaks were in June. So the U.S. stopped objecting.
And the very next meeting was in South America.
Right. So that shows, demonstrates how these issues are linked. I think Steve is probably right that I would love to get rid of governments at ICANN. That's probably not going to happen. No. But I think there's another dynamic that is at play in the GAC advice, which is the GAC gives advice to the board, and then the board is in this position where if they accept the GAC advice, a lot of times that's bad because it's bad advice, and then if they reject it, then the governments, they go to the ITU and they say, look, the GAC isn't working. Right. The GAC is meant to be the way we control ICANN, and it's not working. So we need something to happen at the ITU. So the ITU, I think, is very much tied into this still, and I think we should take advantage of the situation that we find ourselves in to really push for reforms at the ITU, also on transparency and on funding issues. There's yeah. Well, there will be, I'm told, several proposals at the Plenty Pot on transparency of what the ITU is doing. And ideally, I think one thing the U.S. government in particular should look for is funding reform. Right now, the U.S. government gives 120 times what it needs to the ITU, and there's a very arcane rule that says you can only reduce your funding by 15% every 4 years. So, calculating that, it's 60 years that if we decide we want to disengage from the ITU, we're giving above the minimum, which is. When you have that dynamic, it's not a surprise that a lot of governments are doing, things that we don't like at the ITU, up to a lot of mischief.
Yeah, some folks have suggested the best thing to do with the ITU would be to abolish it, but I don't know that that's likely to happen. I'm less concerned with ICANN being absorbed or its functions being absorbed by the ITU than ICANN turning into the internet version of the ITU with a move to Geneva and achievement of some type of international status. And I think, when you look at the Montevideo statement and what the CEO has been saying, there's going to be, whatever this transition plan says, there's going to be a greater role for governments in ICANN in the future than in the past. It's going to be more than merely advisory. We could well have representatives of governments on the board representing the GAC, just like we have representatives of other constituencies sitting on the board. So it's a dynamic situation. It's going to change, and all we can do is try to maximize accountability and minimize the risks at this point in time.
Let's talk about funding a little bit from Eli's point. And I mean, if you look at ITU, you would assume the U.S. didn't agree to that, thinking that one day they might want to back out, or that one day the ITU would have maybe more funds than we think it should have. And ICANN is in a very unique position in that it's it's basically an unregulated monopoly, and it has the ability to extract a lot of money out of the internet ecosystem. It controls names, it controls numbers. It doesn't really charge for IP addresses the way it could. It could do that. There's a lot more IP addresses out there. It can charge for names. It's expanding the namespace. What does this look like in terms of funding long term?
Well, I have to jump in on this one. At the beginning of its existence, ICANN had 9 employees. They had $1 million loan to capitalize them. They had about $1 million a year coming in. ICANN is moving toward 300 employees. Their annual budget is up to $180 million per year. They took in $1/3 billion in application fees for new TLDs, and if there is more government presence, I wouldn't be surprised at some point to see proposals for $1 per year per domain fee for a development fund to fund internet infrastructure projects in the developing world. We hear this at every public forum, calls for this type of thing. We're at about 220, 230 million domains. Now we'll probably be up at 300 million pretty soon with the new TLDs. So $1 domain a year would give you a $300 million a year fund, which ICANN could then put out developments, projects to varying nations in exchange for GAC's support for ICANN policies. The way I think of ICANN, I think of it as, if anyone's ever read The Power Broker by Robert Caro about the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority which is an incredibly powerful agency in the United States in the mid-20th century, it has massive self-funding capabilities. It doesn't need to go to any government or group of governments to have hundreds of millions of dollars a year in cash flow. And I think that's something I've been quite concerned about for some time.
You know, it does put a target on ICANN, and nothing against the way it's run now. ICANN does try, in general, to stay tightly constrained to a limited technical mission. But the only charter on that is this notion of serving the global public interest. Thing is, despite fighting for this for 7 years, I can't get ICANN to undertake the process of defining the public interest when it comes to the domain name system. I've suggested it's very narrow. All we really handle with the domain name system is registrations, itif.org, and resolutions. So that when you pick up your machine and try to reach a website or an email address, ICANN is just handling registrations and resolutions. That's it. So I'd love to see a tight definition of public interest to avoid the risk that Dan and Phil have just mentioned. Because we have had speakers at every ICANN meeting suggesting that the public interest is really about developing nations needing aid at deploying broadband, developing nations needing help at coming up to speed on e-commerce. How about global warming and world hunger? These are all global public interest causes. And if somebody's got a pot of money of $300 million a year, that's a very, very rich target. So I think that the risk here is that having ICANN having no constraint on what is public interest, it'll be whatever a majority thinks it needs to be.
And I have to add that this speculation about some fee for domain, per domain for development projects, it already exists. Under the current .NET agreement, VeriSign collects 75 cents per .NET domain that it turns over to ICANN for supposedly some developing world fund. You can't find out when you look at the ICANN books where that money actually is or what it's been used for. But this is not some speculation. This is already exists. The president is already there for this type of activity.
So I want to open it up to audience questions. So start thinking about that. I want to go one last question for the panel before we do that. As we're looking forward, as NTIA, ICANN, and any other organization, multi-stakeholder group is looking at this transition, what should be the criteria for acceptance? What do we really need to be looking at if we see a proposal out there? I have to say, I think it's disappointing that NTI didn't come to the table with a proposal, at least one proposal, that they said would work. But as we see proposals out there, and we've seen a number already, what should we look for?
I'll suggest that the principles are good as far as they go, and the hard and fast rule that says we will not simply turn it over to a intergovernmental entity. You take that as a given, and then you add specific tests or stress tests. I have 8 of them in my testimony right near the door. I mentioned 3 or 4 of them to you today, but I'm sure that if we work on this, we can come up with a checklist of tests. And if a proposal that emerges over the next year and a half doesn't meet those tests, you go back to the drawing board and do it again. And Dan, I would differ. I don't believe that NTIA had an obligation to propose something the day it indicated it was willing to give it up. That would have had the opposite effect of its intent, right? It would have seemed as if we were still trying to control things. If NTIA begins to coalesce around a really good idea, then it can introduce that in the process because the U.S. government is one of the many groups who are participating in coming up with the proposal.
Yeah, I think NTIA is handling this correctly in terms of stating their what they will and won't accept in broad terms, and then letting the global community sort of hash it out. What that means, though, is that we do have to actually verify that what comes out of this is something that's acceptable. And I think that, unsurprisingly, one of my criteria is just how does it empower or reduce the power of governments, especially to censor or to control the internet.
Yeah, I think the NTIA principles are good as far as they go, but that we need to go further. And what I would add is you need to add in creating as robust and as effective an accountability mechanism you can design.
Maybe independent, maybe external.
Yeah, and you need the missing words in the NTIA statement are private sector leadership, recognizing that governments may have an expanded role. The key thing is to assure that the private sector is still, if this is a car, we want the private sector at the steering wheel, not the governments. That's been the genius of ICANN. I think the U.S., and I'll be a bit of a flag waver, it's hard to think of another government that would have created this incredible telecommunications system, and originally as a defense project, and would have taken it out of government, turned it over to the world and put the private sector in charge, and that's been the genius of ICANN and the genius of the internet. Up to now, it's what's allowed free speech and unlimited innovation, and that's what we want to preserve. So I think the plan has to preserve private sector leadership. If it lets governments take over the steering wheel, if we see the GATT turn into a mini UN with political disputes and majority rule and divisive issues, it's going to be a very different internet going forward, and not one for the better.
Great. So we'll take questions, and just a reminder, if you're watching online and you want to submit questions, just use hashtag ITIF.
So great panel, great information.
You just say your name.
Oh, my name is Steve Miller. I worked in these issues in a previous career. So the point that Phil made about the money, and Robert Moses is a very good analogy, like a self-funding entity has a lot of power. Another little examined fact about ICANN is that it essentially chooses its own board. There's this thing called the NomCom, and they pick their own people in a rather opaque process. At least that's the way I've been laid to understand. So would one possible way to keep the oversight function that Steve mentioned in his comments about having an external oversight to make sure that it keeps to its accountability, would it be to strengthen the board or create something like a board over the existing board? I mean, there's two ways that could be structured. So just some thoughts on that.
I would suggest that some board members are appointed by groups. The generic name supporting organization for Phil and I work gets to nominate a couple of folks. The governments put one person in there. The Security, Stability, and Advisory Committee gets one. But you're right, Steve. There are several seats that are just nominated by the nominating committee. And that is a little bit odd. And the second part of it is where the accountability has to lie. I appreciate your idea that it might be that we structure the board in a certain way that it's less likely to be captured. Another idea completely is to make sure that the ultimate accountability is to an external entity, which under certain conditions, and the lack of security and stability of the root, if they don't operate it well, impingements on free expression and innovation, if there were certain trigger conditions, that the title goes back to some other multi-stakeholder entity. It's not going to come back to the USG. But that will be the ultimate discipline, is to know they could lose control of the internet root if they violated certain principles and conditions.
And just on that point, I'm happy to see so far, while there has been more Republican outcry than Democrat so far about this, there has been bipartisan concern. Former President Clinton, who created ICANN in his administration, has raised concern on this very issue. Yesterday there was a letter by 33 Republicans to the NTIA raising questions. But a few days before that, Senator Warner of Virginia, representing a big internet technology presence in Virginia, and a Democrat, wrote a letter to NTIA. And one of the questions that he asked NTIA to address was we need address specifically transparency around the following matters: in ICANN leadership nominations, which is your point, hiring decisions in the financial interest of ICANN executives, et cetera, et cetera. So these questions are being raised by members of Congress on a bipartisan basis, and I think that type of congressional oversight of the creation of the transition plan is going to be very important to keep things on track and going in a positive direction.
I'd like to ask the other panelists to comment on that specific issue as well. To what extent should a transition plan have congressional review?
I think if there is congressional review, I'd want it to be like sort of a soft review. I think that plays overseas. So I think that Congress should remain alert to these issues and follow the process and watch what's happening. And then, if it does turn out to be a bad transition plan, apply pressure on the Commerce Department to make sure that they're not going to accept it, and be very careful about harming the way the transition is perceived internationally. It's very important that we don't make it look like we're just trying to retain it for selfish reasons or for because we think we're special, right?
Let me suggest that it's almost impossible to pass a driving exam if you have no clue what the rules are. So we should now begin to specify the rules, the stress tests, put some meat on the bones of these relatively sparse principles. And Congress has a role in defining what those are, and you've seen it in some of the letters that are being written. And we'll probably see more. So Congress should, as early as possible, weigh in with a resolution. We've done 4 or 5 resolutions on the internet. We can do another one. And the resolution could indicate the stress tests. Then we let the world community come up with proposals that could meet it. A year and a half, 2 years from today, when Congress reconvenes, they could say, well, it looks to me like these tests have been met by 2 of the 3 conditions, and whatever administration's in place at the time might suggest that it's appropriate to transition to this one. But I don't think we want to wait around with no rules and nothing explicit and simply weigh in from a political point of view 2-3 years from today. That will look terrible.
Yeah, you know, Congress is already involved. A hearing yesterday, another hearing next week, and I'm sure there'll be hearings in the Senate. I think Congress should be involved. I think this is such an important question. It shouldn't be, that it would be better for the country as a whole if both the legislative and executive branches are involved and are addressing all the concerns that various parties have. And it may be that Congress must be involved. There is an outstanding and unresolved question about whether the IANA contract can be transferred away from the U.S. government to any third party without authorizing legislation. And in fact, the very first question in that Republican letter to the NTIA yesterday states a 2000 report by the U.S. GAO stated, quote, it's unclear if the Department of Commerce has the requisite authority, unquote, to transfer control of the IANA function to a private entity. Please provide us with the administration's legal views and analysis on whether the U.S. government can transition the IANA functions to another entity without an act of Congress. I would add to that, there was a memo, a letter to Congress from the then General Counsel of the Department of Commerce in 2000, which was during the Clinton administration, 2 years after ICANN's creation, in which Commerce said, we don't know the answer to this question. It would take extensive research and analysis to come up with an answer we'll feel comfortable with. I have been told personally by senior officials in the NTIA very recently that they believe they do not need a congressional approval to make this transition, but I haven't seen any legal analysis from the Department of Commerce. 33 senators have now asked for that. I think at some point NTIA will be compelled to produce some legal analysis on that point, and in fact there's a bill in the House to have the GAO look at that question. So this is an important, outstanding question about whether authorization is needed. It would certainly change the politics if it is needed, and we don't know the answer yet, but it's in play.
So I'll open it back up to questions. I suspect there's at least one person here that disagrees with some of these perspectives. Go ahead.
I'm Sergey. I'm running some personal studies with regard to the UN role in some spheres, for example, the peacekeeping, peacekeeping in cyberspace. Could you comment on is there any role of the United Nations in the governance of the internet? And what are the main obstacles in the way to transfer that title, which is Steve said, to the United Nations? What are the main obstacles in that way? The United Nations will take over.
So,
will run the internet.
So the question was, what is the role of the United Nations in taking on internet governance, and what are the obstacles to do that?
Sure. The United Nations has no role in internet governance and should never have a role in internet governance. And I think that the NTIA would not. They would not countenance a proposal that gave the UN a role in internet governance.
I would suggest that governments have a lot to do with what their citizens do, whether it's online or offline. Governments do dictate content, commerce, and behavior of their citizens within their borders, whether they're doing it on the internet or out of the back of a truck. So they'll continue to be able to do that. And the internet will be a relevant space in which countries will enforce their laws and policies. As to whether they create law at a body called the UN, that's been less productive. Right? More than likely, the UN takes special projects and initiatives and does pronouncements of things like the human rights conditions. So I don't know that the UN has a role in the management of the top-level domain system that we're talking about here today. They would like to, mostly because the US had it uniquely. Most of the attraction for the United Nations and ITU to take over the title to the top level of the internet is because it was held by us. I really don't think there are big plans to do things with it once it comes into their hands.
Well, just certainly the NTA, their statement, they reject any transition plan that would hand over control of the IANA function to a intergovernmental organization solution. IGOs are usually affiliated with the UN. I think that precludes that for now. There's clearly an existing governmental role, a global governmental role within ICANN. I think the writing's on the wall that government's going to have more say within ICANN down the road. But I personally would not want to see, while the UN can certainly address various issues such as free speech and human rights involved in the internet, I would not want to see management of the domain name system become politicized within a UN context. I think it'd be very counterproductive.
Other questions? I want to go, Steve, to you talked about stress testing, and at the hearing yesterday, I thought one of the most striking comments was Larry Strickland had said that he hadn't been informed or told of any credible threats or risk involved in what might happen in this kind of new world of internet governance. I think this is one of the most central questions. So why don't we spend a little bit of time getting as concrete as we can here. What might be different in the future that would result in some kind of negative event, something that's against the type of security or stability or openness on the internet that we want, that would be different in that future than it is today?
Well, I'll give you an example. Scenario number 5 picks up on something that Phil mentioned, this notion that that ICANN, through its processes, wants to add a new top-level domain to the internet. .corp, .home, .server, whatever it is. And the technical community take a look at that and say, wait a minute, if you add that, it's going to interfere with internal networks where you name it .server yourself or you name it .corp inside. This is the notion of collisions. And it's unknown how serious it will be, but the technical community was telling ICANN, we need to check this out. We need to proceed with caution. So when that comes up, that's a scenario. I identified as scenario number 5, and that if ICANN's governance body was disregarding the advice of the technical community and proceeding anyway, creating risks to the internet's security and stability, I'm suggesting we should ask as a stress test, who would bless that decision? Because today, if ICANN tried to do something to the internet route that violated security, the Commerce Department has an opportunity to say, hang on, let's wait a few weeks, let's check this out, let's go back to the drawing board. And that authority disappears once we give up the IANA authority. So who else would step in and be an independent new set of eyes, an external set of eyes, to suggest that you don't want to endanger the security and stability of the internet? We have one shot to get this right. So I think we have to design for that. And I did list, Dan, several other scenarios, but I mean, what I've done over the last 2 days is learn about other stress tests, particularly those involving .mil and .gov, for instance. And we need to flesh that out. And it will be a learning process for NTIA and for all of us to figure out what the stress tests are. But let's do it in the daylight so that those who are developing proposals can understand the stress tests they'll have to meet. They need to know what questions are going to be on the exam, or they're not going to know how to study.
Yeah, so I think actually just to respond to that particular issue, I think that maybe there's some role for the IETF to exercise greater oversight. It's very technically competent, and of course they practice a different brand of multi-stakeholderism. That's actually very interesting. When you attend an IETF meeting, you represent yourself and not your employer. So governments aren't even recognized at the IETF, nor companies. So they have a very special role in, they can alert, I think, ICANN to a lot of problems. And I think also ICANN has a role in reserving special use domain names, which they could use more constructively. Mm-hmm. There's a proposal right now, an internet draft, to reserve some peer-to-peer domain names. To reserve some special use pseudo top-level domain names for peer-to-peer use, which is really an exciting experiment if it goes forward. that we might not need a hierarchical name system. We might be able to have a sort of peer-to-peer system running alongside the traditional DNS that is separate and that provides another form of a check on ICANN. I think that's a really valuable experiment, and so I think the IETF could play a really good role in the future.
A quick response, and we have a question up here. I think what Secretary Strickland said yesterday was he hadn't heard a plausible scenario for governmental takeover of ICANN. I think what Steve and I have pointed out is that the GAC, under its own operating principles, can move from a consensus-based model to a majority vote model by a single vote.
That's right.
That would change its operation and the whole political dynamics within the GAC. The other thing I would say is that ICANN, 2 months ago, the ICANN board announced the creation of something called the GAGs, G-A-G-S. These were the Globalization Advisory Committees. These were subcommittees created within the board to advise itself on the various issues brought up by globalization, of which this transition plan is a key component. And when you look at, now they did say in Singapore they're going to dissolve some of these committees because of the NTIA announcement, but I think it's useful to look at the focus of these committees to understand what is in play with this whole globalization movement, of which the transition plan is one part, but what happens at Net Mondiale and IGF and ITU are other component parts. Fadi Chahdi said in Singapore that the Net Mondiale is addressing a vast mosaic, and the IANA transition is just a few little tiles in this much bigger mosaic of what's going on. And the issues those subcommittees were going to focus on were the continuation and enforcement of the affirmation of commitments, the legal system for contracted parties and the policy-making structures within ICANN, the security and stability of the root zone server system, the persistence, vitality of the multi-stakeholder model, and the scope of Internet governance. So there's a lot on the table. There's a lot more in play right now than just the IANA functions.
Thanks. We'll go to the question just on Steve's point. It is very interesting. We talk about this scenario planning. I mean, computer security,
right.
It's so advanced. How you have Alice and Bob and Eve who's always trying to hack, and you do so many scenarios, and that's the only way you test these security protocols. And when we're looking at these governance structures, we're not doing that right now. We're assuming it will work, and that's the mistake that we've historically made in computer systems when they fail. So I think that's
exactly right. And principles don't seem to be really enough to test the theoretical structure.
Right. Please.
I apologize for being late, so I've missed a lot of what you...
We saved the front seat for you.
Oh, good. Well, it's the only place I could find a seat. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm a social anthropologist by training, but I ended up working for IBM for 13 years and was their marketing manager for Reagan's Star Wars program. So I play in this game. I'm reading Michael Lewis's new book right now called Fast Boys, and I recommend it to all of you to understand the role of the geeks along with everybody else in both the governance structure, the business structure. We don't educate people to think about complexity. And on the whole, we don't educate people to understand what these things are. I mean, you talk in code. So if you're trying to educate a broader public, unless you have a glossary which explains what each one of these institutions does, the conversation still rests in a very small group. Maybe that's fine. I honestly don't know. But if you think transparency is important, you might want to find some translators who could educate a broader public on this.
Let me suggest something. If the glossary could be instantly mind melded to you, it wouldn't really help at all. All that really matters is understanding how will this affect my life, my freedom of expression, my ability to start a new business, my ability to find information on a relatively risky topic.
Who's writing that?
Those are the scenarios that we need your help to write. I've written 8 of them. You give me a few more tonight, and all of us, there's some great minds in this room, we need to get to work on the specifics on how it'll affect everyday life. It really won't help to understand the acronym soup of this, because it doesn't get to the nub of why you should even care.
I would add, There are online guides to ICANN. You can't operate with an ICANN without acronyms. It just, there's too many words, otherwise we're always talking about the GAC and the GNSO and CCTLDs and GTLDs.
I've been with the Feds for 37 years.
And this
I
and that.
understand the need for this.
But you can have that guide to the acronyms. It's not going to tell you anything about how ICANN works or how it should work. You really have to, people have to really, if somebody really wants to understand the operation of ICANN, the technical operation of the domain name system, it takes a lot of time and study. It can be done, and there's lots of people like us who are happy to help explain it, but there's got to be a willing public that really wants to go beyond the superficialities and get into the details of what's going on here.
I agree with all of that.
Cool. And why did Star Wars have a marketing department? Who are we selling it to?
We were selling computers to the government.
Please.
Yeah, I'm Jason Stern. I'm CEO of Brad Communications. One of the concerns I have, if you're a startup company and you want to start up, how is this going to affect you like 3 to 5 years from now? If we turn this over to a global body to govern, how is this going to affect us all? I mean, I work with a lot of small companies, and you know, when you talk about stress tests, and as I think you have, Steve, there, do they ever think at NTIA of how this will affect a small company in the days to come here? Because if you're thinking globally, every country is going to think about their own concerns and their trade needs, and they're going to help their own. So if it turns into a global function, where does that leave a small company that has a great idea that wants to go global?
Yeah, because as soon as I put a website on the internet or build an app, it's instantly visible to everyone on the planet. I didn't exactly mail it to Moscow, but people in Moscow will see it the millisecond it's up there. So that subjects an entrepreneur with a great idea to the regulation and taxation of virtually every regime on the planet. That today is a tolerable risk, since maybe Moscow doesn't like this application I built. Maybe they don't like the website, but the most they can do is they can block me in Russia. They can penalize people in Russia for using my application, but they really can't get a hold of me because jurisdiction doesn't extend. So the biggest concern would be the taxation and jurisdictional regulation reach that's empowered on some reciprocity or reciprocal basis across country lines. That would be a non-starter. I don't know how a small business could simultaneously comply with the taxation, regulation, and rules, censorship rules of every nation on the planet the day before they launch. They'd never launch. And so I'm applauding your idea, and let's see if we can come up with some stress tests that particularly get to the ability of small firms to have access to the global internet.
So I agree with Steve's comments, but I would stress that I don't think that this is a 3 to 5 year issue, right? I think 3 to 5 years from now, we'll probably still be fine. It's what we really have to worry about is the long-term erosion of the institutions. I think 3 to 5 years is just too short of a period to really be concerned about.
Eli's right. Innovation without permission is the creed that has enabled us to do as well as we have. And that becomes, well, innovation with permission, please. If I can't put a new domain in a new top-level domain. Now, I'm not suggesting no regulation at all. There's a new top-level domain called .accountant. Should or should not the .accountant domain require that people to the left of the dot, Steve Del Bianco .accountant, be a certified public accountant in whatever country I work in? And that's an open question. And the US government, NTIA, along with many other governments, are saying, wait a minute, it should be. When you're a regulated profession, people will count on that with a certain level of trust. There's a .cpa, .lawyer, .doctor. So that's an open question about how much regulation we want to impose there to protect consumers. Some might say that consumer protection could turn into innovation prevention. So it's not a black and white line, right? So let's participate in that discussion, but understand that some regulation is appropriate. The idea is to stop regulation and taxation that would block innovation, because that's its very purpose.
And since Steve mentions innovation without permission, I think my colleague Adam Thierer would kill me if I didn't mention that he has a new book out called Permissionless Innovation, which you should all which you should all buy and read.
What's the title again?
Permissionless Innovation.
Just to add briefly, it's not just Moscow, and it's not just within ICANN. It's broader issues going on in internet governance and jurisdictional issues with activities on the internet, but the Europeans are certainly pro-free market and free speech, but the European Union has proposals which would export European data privacy and other laws to any U.S. company doing business on the internet. So there is a possibility. Up to now, we've had a situation where unless you're actively targeting another nation, you're not subject to their laws. You're just subject to the jurisdiction and the laws of the nation in which you're located. But that could change. It's not directly tied in with this IANA transition debate,
Right.
but it's part of this much broader mosaic discussion that's going on in all these different forums.
So last question, we're out of time. We began in some ways with Snowden revelations, since they're completely unrelated. But let's end there too. In many ways, this has obviously been a reaction to those revelations for many reasons. Has this announcement restored U.S. credibility, diplomacy, leadership, or is it in some ways a token offering that isn't going to change it?
That's a good question. I think it has not completely restored U.S. credibility on this issue. I think, like I said in my earlier comments, that the U.S., is, because it is trying to operate on all these fronts internationally, it's very constrained, a lot more constrained than we realized. And so this is a step toward loosening the constraints a little bit, but I don't think it gets us all the way there.
I'd suggest that we've already passed the high watermark of goodwill. It's like when you propose to your wife, that's probably as good as it gets, and it's downhill from there. We are already witnessing the fact that as we put details and meat on the bones of what the new structure would look like, the gesture of the United States will lose its luster. But make no mistake about it, there were plenty of people that were incredibly appreciative. And there's nobody that didn't understand that the timing in this announcement was keyed to Snowden and the fact that Brazil meeting in the end of this month and the ITU this year. That's the timing. But sooner or later, we were going to do this. We had to do this. It's a global resource, the internet. And so we're enjoying the glow, but the glow is fading fast.
I don't think it's had any effect on the views in other national capitals or different groups about the NSA revelations. I think they were unrelated to, completely unrelated factually to the U.S. role vis-a-vis IANA. You can look at what ICANN did in precipitating Net Mundial and Montevideo as either reacting to the risk to the multi-stakeholder model and trying to do something to save it, or in utilizing what was going on to achieve a goal they already had in place. But regardless, I think this is seen correctly in other capitals, by other governments, as an attempt by the U.S. to shape and set limits on what can happen once the U.S. steps out. I think it can be effective somewhat in the short term, but once the transition happens, then the U.S. has no more control than any other nation about what happens in the long term.
Okay. Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking our panelists. I encourage everyone to